Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second session of Seasons of Responsibility. And in this session, we're really kicking off the interreligious nature of this. We started this process by thinking about what is this season about. And we started with a really robust group of thinkers, and we're partnering with the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue. They do a lot of work within JTS of presenting of pulling together groups from different parts, different religious communities. And my colleagues at the Milstein Center, Bert Visotsky and Benjamin, came on and brought this group together to start thinking through what would it look like to talk about environmentalism in terms of interreligious response. And when we started thinking about this framing in terms of environment, that we felt like if we missed the boat of talking about Indigenous perspectives, then we were missing something massive in terms of looking at environmental concern and responsibility. And what does climate justice look like in 2026 without those voices? So I'm really delighted that we have Roberto Múkaro Borrero to join us today. And he is speaking in conversation with our Associate Dean, Stephanie Ruskay. And both of them provide compelling perspectives. And as Stephanie is going to kind of kick off, Roberto is literally just back from New Zealand, so we have some interesting concepts to discuss and explore there as well. I'm doing twofold here. I'm managing the Q&A section, and I'm also going to be managing the tech section. So I'll get all of those things in the chat that Tani normally puts in there a little bit later once things slow down for me. But just know this is number 2. There's 7 sessions in this series, and we're really excited about this schedule. The other thing I want to do is to thank all of you who've donated to support this, and to thank our partners at Milstein for helping support this series, and our programming partners at the Union Theological Seminary, their Center for Earth Ethics, and the Jewish Climate Trust. But if you'd like to sponsor a session or if you want to make a donation, that's still possible. Again, I'll put that link in the chat later. Now, I'd like to turn it over to introductions of our fabulous speakers. And I did the thing I do. I'm Ellie Gettinger. I'm the Director of Outreach for JTS, and welcome, as always, to another one of our webinar sessions. So today we are joined by 2 really fabulous speakers. Our first is Roberto Múkaro Borrero. He is he's a multi-hyphenate. He has a distinguished and diverse background in policy and program development, and he's worked with the UN and a number of other international organizations. And right now he actually is also a fellow at the Center for Earth Ethics as well. He retains over 25 years of experience actively engaging the UN systems in thematic areas such as sustainable development and climate change, among others. He is a citizen of the Guainía Taíno Tribe of Borikén in the Virgin Islands. And in 2012, he was traditionally sanctioned as a kasike, a chief of his tribe. Joined with me also is Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay, and she's the Associate Dean of the Rabbinical School and Executive Director of the JTS Hendel Center for Ethics and Justice. She's made her career throughout the world of Jewish social justice, and she served in leadership positions at the American Jewish World Service, Auburn Theological Seminary, Avodah, the Jewish Service Corps, and Join for Justice. At JTS, she directs field education and entrepreneurial endeavors and is focused on raising the scope and profile of social justice work and community organizing within the contemporary rabbinate. So I'm delighted to hear what their conversation is. We're going to have some time for questions. Please throw those questions to me and I will share them with our speakers. You can also share your technical questions with me. And we're going to be focusing on a report that was done by the Center for Earth Ethics a few years ago, and I'll be putting the link to that in the chat as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie, who will then get this conversation started.
Thank you, Ellie. Okay, so I consider my role here today to be sort of our ambassador and learning more from Roberto about his community. The work they do around the environment and how we could be better, more knowledgeable partners in working together. So I have a bunch of questions and I'll be glad to see where the conversation takes us and also what is generated by those of you who are joining and witnessing it. So Roberto, thanks for being here and doing this with us. So you just came back from New Zealand, and I wondered if you could tell us more about the context for the trip, why you were there, what was it like, and that will start to be our window into your community.
Thank you very much. So I'll say a short greeting in the Taino language, which is not English or Spanish. So I'll say Taigwe dituno, kina ateono, diri mukaro aguibana, Borikén Taíno daka, kawai daka, kawai daka, kawai daka. So just a quick greetings, letting you know, as you mentioned, my name. Also highlighting the islands where my lineage comes from, and saying that I'm very happy to be here with you all today. As you mentioned, my folks come from the island of Borikén, from the Guainía Taíno Tribe, and that's one of the Taino tribes that whose traditional homelands extend through the Caribbean islands all the way to the southern tip of Florida in the U.S. That was our once expansive homelands for Taino people. As you just asked, yeah, I'll just share a little bit about my most recent trip. I had the great honor to travel to Aotearoa, which is the Maori or the indigenous name for New Zealand. And this was in relation to the commemoration of what they call Waitangi Day. And Waitangi Day is a national holiday there. It marks the 1840 signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. And so this event, it commemorates the nation's founding. This is like the founding document between the British Crown and the Maori chiefs, and it serves as a national day for reflection on the shared history between uh, non-Indigenous New Zealanders and the Maori peoples. It's an ongoing discussion taking place that's done annually. It really talks about the let's say the disparities between the English and the Maori, the cultural significance of the relationship between the Maori and the Crown. There's all kinds of events that lead up to the actual treaty day that's commemorated on February 6th. And I was there on behalf of an organization called the International Indian Treaty Council, or IITC. And the IITC was the very first Indigenous Peoples organization that was accredited with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. So it was the first Indigenous NGO that was registered at the UN in 1977. The organization is over 50 years old now, and the organization has affiliates throughout the Americas and into the Pacific because of the main subject, as you could imagine from the name of the organization, treaties, and treaties being a part of international national law are very significant to many indigenous peoples, and in this particular case, very significant to the Maori. So actually, IITC will be co-sponsoring a treaty meeting in New Zealand or Aotearoa next year. So part of my role there was to talk about that particular meeting and to receive support from the Maori leaders. And so I had a series of talks and participated in various events over the week leading up to that final day on February 6th. And I had the great honor to participate in some very significant events, including the opening ceremony, the dawn ceremony for the actual Waitangi Day. I was able to share some words um, along with a host of national leaders, Maori and non-Maori, at the Waitangi site where they signed the treaty. That was an incredible honor for me. Also carrying message from the International Indian Treaty Council as well as my own people in the Caribbean. And so that was my goal and my role there to really find support for the event. Our presentations were very well received, and so now we'll go into planning for an international gathering with not just Maori, but with indigenous peoples from throughout the Americas and the Pacific who have treaties with the various colonial powers, and we'll discuss where we are at this particular moment in time uh, as indigenous peoples. What the treaties mean, how are they being honored or perhaps violated. um, yeah, these are the type of things that went on, and that was just a little bit about my trip to Aotearoa.
Thank you. So if you find that treaties are being violated, who has the ability and the responsibility to address it?
Yeah, this is an ongoing um, contention for those who are engaged with treaties. For example, in the United States, an ongoing criticism has been that indigenous people should not have to litigate treaty violations using the same system that's violating them, which is one of the reasons why indigenous people started to engage the United Nations back in the 70s. Um, if some of you recall, during the 60s and 70s, there were these power movements that were going on, red power, black power, different things that were happening to highlight violations of human rights and civil rights. And indigenous peoples from throughout the Americas gathered in 1974 at the Standing Rock Reservation in South Dakota to have a meeting about this very issue. And folks came from Canada, the US, Central and South America, and they spoke about violations of indigenous peoples. And one of the things that they determined was that if indigenous peoples were not getting restitution for their issues at the local national levels, then they had really no choice but to take their concerns to the international level to apply pressure. So on these colonial governments. So folks went to the United Nations in 1974 rather, and well, let me backtrack there. They gathered in 1974 in Standing Rock, and they made a decision to engage the international forum. So by 1977, they were going to Geneva, Switzerland, to engage in some meetings that were being conducted there on the issues of indigenous peoples. And from there, from the 1974 meeting, there was also a mandate to establish an international organization, and that organization is the International Indian Treaty Council, which continues today, as I mentioned already. And so, yeah, so what's available now is that they take if there are concerns, you're taking them to the national government. However, there's been over 30 years of advocacy within the UN system to try to engage the international system, especially in the question of treaties and on the violation of treaties.
Thank you. You can take a breath now, but I'm mainly going to ask you questions.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah.
Could you say something about at Standing Rock or other moments where Indigenous communities came together for protests? How did you find that other faith communities, particularly Jews, but not only, like showed up? Like, did they? Did you find that they were natural allies and there was a way to engage religious communities And if not, what did you perceive to be some of the challenges of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for Indigenous peoples, um, there's a complex relationship with religious organizations, and there's been a sort of evolving of that relationship over the years from more paternalistic kind of missionary efforts to more contemporary, I would say, reconciliation focused initiatives. So many of you have probably already heard about, especially in the context of the United States, about issues of boarding schools, for example. So many of these were run by um, Christian denominations, and the idea was to assimilate American Indians into the American culture or the U.S. culture. And at these places, there was many violations against children, everything from just physical abuse. There was a prohibition on speaking native languages. There was sexual abuse. Many children were uh, killed or died due to these abuses. Some were buried in unmarked graves. Um, told their families told that they had run away, and so this is one of probably one of the bigger challenges that as indigenous peoples in the United States have faced. And this is also the case for Canada and for missionary activities that have took place throughout the rest of the Americas as well. So there was really a more of a paternalistic relationship, and that hasn't completely dissipated. And more recently, especially with the current administration, there seems to be renewed effort on that idea of assimilation and um, the imposition of religious organizations on and within indigenous peoples communities throughout the U.S. and even around the world. Um, but over the years, there's been many positive initiatives um, that I could say uh, that have been initiated by or through partnerships with indigenous peoples. For example, a number of Christian denominations they have issued formal apologies for the really significant abuses of the past, and they've not only repudiated doctrines of discovery. What I mean by that, doctrines of discovery, is that when uh, when the original colonists were coming over to this side of the world, um, those trips that they took were supported uh, by the religious organizations that were in power during that time. So many of you know the popular nursery rhyme 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and this next is how he discovered America or the Americas. But that trip was sanctioned by the church at the time, and it was not only a colonizing mission for resources, because many of the resources at that time were being depleted over in what we now know as Europe and in those areas. But it was also a colonizing mission for religious indoctrination as well. So again, it was not only for the resources and gold, but it was also to convert many indigenous peoples, well, all indigenous peoples, that they could into, at least in this particular context, Christianity. So that's the history. That's where it starts out. And as I said, it's not really a complete history of the past, because there are still many religious organizations that have worked and continue to try to convert indigenous peoples to those religions. We see this happening right now in the Amazon, with incursions there and into these more remote communities by missionaries. And those are the challenging and the historical tragedies, right? That occurred between these encounters. But since that time, at least from the 70s, the 60s and 70s, with those movements and a shifting in concern to civil rights and human rights, there's been many social justice initiatives that have been undertaken by religious communities and organizations. So you have support for various programs that are not focused on conversion, but actual support. Um, as I mentioned, you had a number of religious, especially Christian denominations, that have repudiated the earlier doctrines of discovery. Um, there's been work of interfaith coalitions, building solidarity and bridges of understanding between faiths and the spirituality and spiritual leaders of indigenous peoples. There has been now, some of you might have heard of this term called land back. And this is actually a process where many religious organizations have been rethinking their role in the colonization process, and they're actually returning land to indigenous peoples that was taken from, and now they're returning land back to indigenous peoples. And we also see growing support uh, in the movement for environmental and social justice. So various faith groups now partner with indigenous peoples communities to protect sacred lands, for example. Um, there's all sorts of examples that I can cite from throughout the United States. I know in particular in the tri-state area, one of the churches has returned land to the Ramapola Nape over in New Jersey and on the New York side. And there's also been support for other local area indigenous peoples. In California, there's been land that has been given back. There's just a number of examples. With interfaith, there's also an interfaith rainforest initiative that's helping to protect indigenous peoples. So I think that those are some uh, interesting examples. Now, with the Jewish community in particular, I think for me, as far as I understand it, and what I've read over the years and what I've seen over the years, um, there's been more individual support by American Jews, for example, in supporting the rights of Native Americans or American Indians. And over the years, I think starting back with the New Deal, there was Jewish support for Native American rights, and that started to become more organized around that time. So there was Jewish civil servants, lawyers, educators, social scientists, anthropologists who advocated for indigenous peoples. And that took place during that time, again around the New Deal time. And in the 70s, as I've mentioned, during those power movements, we go back to South Dakota again, where the Ogallala Sioux, they were involved in the Wounded Knee occupation. Some of you might remember that or have heard of that. And this is where Native Americans had a standoff with the FBI because of the abuses that were going on the reservation. It resulted in a number of deaths and imprisonment of Native advocates. One of the most famous was Leonard Peltier, who was just released during the close of the Biden administration after from the 70s to just last year being released. He was in prison during that time, and there was many many of the lawyers who were representing the Ogallala Sioux advocates were Jewish, and so that was very significant. And then, if you recall now, as I mentioned, Standing Rock as a historic point for the American Indian movement and for the International Indian Treaty Council. But most recently, when we talk about environmental advocacy, some of you might remember or might be more familiar with Standing Rock and the Standing Rock Reservation, because that was a height of the protest. That was the central place of protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And that took place, that was in 2016. So there was at least 9 rabbis, there was rabbinical students and Jewish community centers who were arrested in acts of civil disobedience that was put on during a rally that was organized by the Jewish Voice for Peace in Philadelphia. So there was there was a number of people and the Jewish support for American Indians during the Standing Rock, that Dakota Access Pipeline protest was really highlighted during that time. That's the most current that I've seen. Can support be better, or can we find better ways? Of course, we can do that. But I'm at least happy to say that there has been some, and that these things have been evolving from, as I mentioned in the beginning, a more paternalistic relationship to one focused really on social justice and environmental justice.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it seems like both from my reading and from listening to you that like a lot of the connection, particularly with the church, has been reactive, and like it was a terrible past. And so now it's like they're trying to make up for it. And
Yes.
Jews have been kind of separate, like they both largely as a community were not involved in the initial traumas. And like individuals sort of found their path around social justice movements. But like JVP, for instance, it is a sort of more marginal part of the community. And it's not like, if that's who your main connection has been with, then it's not like a particularly mainstream sort of organizing effort together, which is interesting to hear and be curious about, like why that is. and like for the Jews on the Zoom to like think about, is that what we would like the story to be, that like mainstream efforts have not sort of collaborated or not, but it seems like most of it has been reactive. Could you talk a little bit about land? And like, it seems to me like a lot of your spiritual practice is related to place, location, land. Can you worship and can you sort of practice your spiritual like religion if you don't have the land?
Yes, that's also a very good question. I mean, spirituality of Indigenous peoples is really place-based because of that relationship uh, with their original homelands. Many Indigenous peoples don't have, they've been in their places for so long that they don't have real migration stories. I know my own people, even though scientifically we can say that the um, the birth of Taino people was a result of migrations coming into the Caribbean over thousands and thousands of years. What what emerged and what evolved into the Taino people, we don't have a migration story. We actually believe that and see ourselves as coming from the land itself. And in a way that you could look at it and you could see the why they would say that, because if these different indigenous peoples or these different tribal groups had come into that area over such a long time and then finally developed into this one group, that group was really born in that territory. And so the stories, the relationships um, with the spirits and the deities that we engage with really come from that relationship. And can we continue a relationship outside of those lands? Of course, we can engage in some aspects of that, but some of that is lost, right? When you don't have your connection and your availability to get back to land. This is why when so many indigenous peoples were displaced from lands during colonization and sent to other territories, it was very traumatic for them, and that resulted in a lot of mental health issues, depression, and that led to other situations for indigenous people. So you have many peoples from the East Coast, for example, indigenous peoples that were forcibly removed to Oklahoma, to a new area that they would term Indian country there. And some of those folks, there was remnants of some of those folks who remained in the areas. That's why you have like some Cherokee tribes, for example, in the Carolinas, and you have some out west, right? And this is true for many other indigenous peoples. You mentioned the report that we had put together with the or via the Center for Earth Ethics, the Freedom to Be report. And I think that if people do have a time to peruse the report, they'd find many interesting examples of that relationship of land. I'll give you one that struck me um, during those conversations, because I had the honor to moderate a few of those sessions, right? There was the report, but the Center for Earth Ethics also organized a series like this series here, speaking with indigenous peoples, talking about religion and freedom of religion. And there was a young woman from Brazil, Taili Terena, um, who was sharing a story about a lake in her community where they have a lot there's a lot of it's really a key point for the spirituality of the tribe there. And because of climate change, the lake has actually been losing water, and so it really threatens that that part of their spirituality, because of their spiritual relationship with that lake. There's other instances where sacred sites, places of worship, these might not be a church or a synagogue, but a particular land area that folks go to annually or at certain times of the year because of development that happens. Uh, those places might be impacted in a very negative way. They might be overcome, overrun, or there might be difficulty now to get to these places that they've been used to over many, many generations of engaging with, giving offerings or making prayers or whatever way they engage with that land. But these are the real impacts, right? So you not only have the impacts, um, like I shared in this example in Brazil, through climate change, but you also have developmental impacts, meaning that the colonizing government wants to use land. I think another case that I could cite that's in the news now more recently, even than Standing Rock, is the Apache stronghold. There's a place in the Apache territories that was designated for them to conduct their religious ceremonies, rituals, etc. but now there's an interest by a copper mine to go in there, and this place was saved during the Biden administration, but now those executive orders have been reversed rather during this current Trump administration. So now there's talk about now the company now actually having access to the Apache stronghold and going in to start doing mining. And this is a really has a really negative impact on Apache peoples in that area of the U.S.
I'm going to jump in with a question from our audience. I know we're going to get to kind of the environmental concerns, so I'm saving a question for that for the end. But right now, actually, I think as we're in this kind of technical universe of, where Stephanie is acting as our interlocutor, the question is that there's this challenge with language, and we all know that it went from Indian to Native American to Indigenous person. Like, what is the linguistic way that you actually that works in talking about Indigenous people? And when you're speaking, especially to an individual, is it the sort of thing that you ask for preference and say, well, what is the definition? What are the terms that you prefer?
Yeah, I think when speaking to an individual, it's good to know what they prefer. Um, I think now we're at a certain point because of the engagement with the United Nations over the years and the advocacy at the United Nations, which resulted in what's called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous peoples is a more favorable term to many to use when we're talking about, because then we can talk about American Indians, we could be talking about Aboriginal Australians, we could be talking about the Maori, for example, of New Zealand. We can even be talking about the Sami people in Europe. They used to be a long time ago. I know at least when I went to school, they used to be referred to as the Laplanders, and they prefer, of course, being called Sami, and they have a relationship with the governments in Finland, Norway, Sweden, for example. Those are the reindeer herding people traditionally, and they have a different language than the mainstream of those countries. And so we use the term indigenous peoples more generally when we're speaking about uh, these various these various peoples around the world that have this kind of pre-colonial existence, right? Here in the United States, it's a little different. Um, yes, indigenous peoples has been used, but many still like to use the term American Indian. Some like to use the term Native American. If you look at the census, for example, they use the term American Indian, and this is to kind of identify not only folks in the United States, but any person of indigenous ancestry from throughout the Americas, and that's how they count that in the U.S. Census. But there's some folks who really prefer the term Native American. There's some folks, like I said, I work with an organization that still uses the term Indian. And why do they do that? Well, it's important to them because in the Constitution and in treaty, they mention Indian tribes, right? So it's a legal definition also, not just, this kind of ethnic definition. So it's the same thing with indigenous peoples. It's become an international human rights terminology that actually has international human rights law that's been built around this terminology. So not everybody was happy with the term, but it's a term that needs to be used. So in the United States, that term Indian, as I said, it was mentioned in the Constitution, and it's mentioned in actual case law in the Supreme Court. So they say Indian tribes, right? And so many will still use the term, even though they know that it's not the proper term, but it is the term that's used legally. So they just can't just throw it away because it's actually within the system.
Fascinating. I think that is one of the hardest. You're in this world. You don't want to be the people who are. You don't want to be offensive, but you
Yes.
also there's all this baggage and background that you're constantly dealing with. I'm going to,
Can I say just one more thing about
of
this,
course.
just very quickly? Um, I mean, all the indigenous peoples I know would prefer to be called by the name they call themselves, right? So we've heard the term Sioux used when we talk about the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples. They rather be called Lakota, but they will still deal with people when they say, "Oh, you're part of the Sioux tribe," for example. The same thing with the Navajo. Navajo is not the original name. They prefer to use the term Dene, which is how they describe themselves. So, if you go there and say, "Oh, is the Navajo reservation nearby?" They're not going to just, explode. Ah, we're not Navajo. No, because they've come to terms with people knowing that terminology. But hopefully, through positive engagement, you'll learn the terms, right, of those peoples, and wherever the listeners today or those who are tuning in find themselves, whatever states, they might be aware of indigenous peoples from their area and might know the names of those tribes. And so it's more proper, if you do know the names of the tribes, to use the name of the tribes if you know that. But if not, I mean, American Indian is probably good in this context. Native American is also good. Again, it's not gonna, everybody is not pleased with all these terms. So you might find some who are a little more, some folks who are a little bit more picky about these things. But overall, I think it's best that you ask people how they would like to be described as.
Okay. I have a question about international development work. I feel like we more frequently hear of examples where somebody is directing development work, and then there's a conflict around land and spiritual practice and resource, maybe like the river or the lake that you were telling us about. Is there any example you could think of where development work has been done that took into account and partnered with an indigenous community, so that it wasn't a reaction, but it was actually built into the fabric?
Yes, well, um, that obviously that there's more negative instances than there are positive, and it's only been in my understanding, from what I've seen, it's only been in more recent years where the discussion of rights has come up,
Mhm.
and the rights of indigenous peoples, and that's due to the advocacy of indigenous peoples at places like the United Nations or the Organization of American States, for example, where there's a legal precedent, right, that's established, saying you just can't do this, or they've been taken to court over some issues. Standing Rock is a good example of that. The Lakotas had a treaty, um, have a treaty with the with the United States. They have a few treaties, and that they feel that the treaty is violated by the Dakota Access Pipeline going through their land, because when they first started to do that pipeline, they actually wanted to route it near one of the non-indigenous cities, right? But then the people in the cities were saying, no, we don't want this pipeline near us because it could cause A, B, and C damage, right? But when it was then rerouted towards the reservation and through the reservation, then it seemed to be okay for a majority of people in that area. But they didn't talk about the same type of damage, even though that's what could happen. So I think that when there has been development that has found or engaged in what we call the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples, it's only because of the idea of the legal challenges that could amount, that could come about because of this, and then of course the expense of going through legal challenges. So it seems to be more productive to actually consult with indigenous peoples before these takes place, if people are concerned about their budget, timelines, etc. I could say that there's an example now in California where in the past they were damming all these rivers, right? They were just damming rivers all over the place. Recently, though, that there has been a uh, a move to remove some of those dams, which would allow salmon to come back into those rivers because they were blocked once those dams came, and that really had a major impact on many of the indigenous peoples who made their livelihood from engaging with salmon. And now these salmon populations are actually returning to those ancient spawning grounds after so many years of being blocked off. And now they're having a comeback. So this is having a positive effect. So that's kind of like a developmental engagement. There was also a recent consultation with various indigenous peoples, various American Indian tribes, um, around the Colorado River. Now, they were talking about access to the river and blocking off possibly some of the river because of the water issues that take place in that region. But they did engage with a number of the tribes to try to find solutions. So I would say that that is a positive developmental initiative also that has gone on recently. Um, there's not an overwhelming response. There's not an overwhelming, there aren't overwhelming examples I can give because this is still ongoing. And because this current administration has really reversed its course on that dialogue that was taking place, not only with American Indian tribes, but with the environment overall. You know, we've had many years of incremental advancements on environmental issues from pollution, mercury, dealing with mercury in water and in other areas. But uh, and even the idea of phasing down the use of fossil fuels and coals. Now this administration is reversing on all of that, and as I mentioned, you know, some of the positive things that were done in the past, like I just recalled the Arctic National Refuge over in Alaska. Now this is a place that many Alaska Indigenous peoples engage with because of the caribou herds, right, that come through there. It's a birthing ground for many of the caribou, large caribou herds that, again, are also part of their culture and livelihood. Um, but now, even though oil exploitation was banned from that particular area, the Arctic National Refuge, now this Trump administration wants to open it up for leasing, and so that's going to have a detrimental impact. So really, political will has an impact on these situations, right? And we went from years of advancement now to reversing all of this.
Would you say that doing environmental advocacy work is part of how you practice your religion and spiritual practice?
I would say that it certainly is connected to that because saving these places uh, really is saving a part of our spirituality, the spirituality that engages with these places. And as I mentioned, uh, we can practice some parts of spirituality outside of these areas, but
Mhm.
it really does add trauma to a people when you cannot return to these homelands, right? And you cannot engage in the places where you feel that there is a significant part of your history, um, and that really does do a multi-generational trauma to a community.
Yeah. There's probably a very interesting conversation at a different moment to be had around the Jewish experience of exile and diaspora and indigenous communities. And like
Yes,
both have had to try to adapt in different ways. And
yes.
that might be an interesting sort of commonplace for discussion. Um, what would you say is sort of the wisdom or for the moment that your community might bring around how to take care of the earth in challenging times?
Well, I think amongst many indigenous peoples, there is a multi-generational vision, right? You might have heard this terminology, the seven generations principle, meaning that when we are thinking about um, our engagement and development, we're thinking not only of the present, but seven generations into the future. How our decisions today are going to impact those future generations. And you see now these terminologies of future generations making their way into other discussions now. But I think that really indigenous peoples have really championed this idea, at least um, historically. You can hear uh, discussions with leaders and speeches with leaders that really talk about this particular issue. What is our responsibility, not only to this generation but for generations ahead? Also, that seeing yourself not as the dominant, right? This idea of dominance over creation is something else that I've seen, and that I could say that maybe is a little different from the way other peoples look at nature and our relationship to nature. In other words, not just eh, for many indigenous, even my own people, nature is not just a resource; it's the source, right? It's the source of who we are,
Mhm.
and those ancient covenants that we have with the animals and the plants and things like that. They are actual relationships, and there's a lot of stories about how we connect to these things and these other beings on the earth, these other energies. And so that idea of respect and reciprocity, I think, is another contribution that we can make to this conversation. Really, the idea of not just taking, but also what are we giving back. I think those are some other basic tenets that I've seen practice amongst indigenous peoples and their various expressions of spirituality.
There, how do you think in your spiritual practice about meat eating and like animals, like and using animals for various things?
Yeah, I think that has that links to what I was just sharing about our idea of what the covenants are. Of course, many indigenous peoples engage in some kind of meat eating practice, and but there's a certain respect that, at least traditionally, that was there. All right. And that's what I mean about reciprocity. So it's not just taking, but there was prayers and offerings made, uh, understanding the cycle, right? That cycle of life and why it was necessary um, to engage with animals in that way. Of course, today, we're in a different uh, point in our in on all of our lives and all of our collective lives. So, you have some discrepancies amongst indigenous. Indigenous peoples now own cattle, for example. If you go out west, and then, there's others who engage in other type of animal husbandry type of activities. And so I don't think indigenous peoples are devoid of these problems that we all face, and these ethical issues that we all have to face. But traditionally speaking, I would say that there was a more of a reverence, right, that was given to animals and to those interactions.
Mhm. And so would you say, like in addition to reciprocity, would restraint be kind of a word that you would use as part of a religious practice?
Sure, I would say so. I know that even in my own personal life, we've been impacted by colonialism, and many of our traditional foods have lowered in estimation or not even available anymore. And so we've had to also adapt, right? Because of our engagement with the wider systems around us. And so I know in recent years I've made it more of a point to cut down on meat consumption and focus also on traditional food practices. Excuse me. Sorry. I'll give you an example right now. One of the Taino organizations that I work with, United Confederation of Taino People, we have a project now in Puerto Rico that is focusing on traditional practices, and we just purchased some land there, and we will be doing this as a kind of a pilot project to reintroduce traditional farming, for example, and how that engages with our spirituality. And so I hope to have more news as we continue to develop that site. It will be open to visitors, and people could see, how we're dealing with that issue. Because on an island like Puerto Rico, because of colonialism, I could tell you that over time, that island would be able to produce all the food it would need for its population. Now, in this current time, Puerto Rico imports 80% of its food product from outside on an island that could grow its food year round. So that gives you an idea of how assimilation impacts our people.
Oh, sorry, I think I messed something up, but I hopefully didn't. We have a lot of questions that are in kind of two big areas. One in this area of environmental concern, and the other in this area of like understanding and better. And so I'm going to try and frame kind of the understanding questions in one big universe to
Sure.
say, Roberto, when you're pointing people towards resources, and I will tell you some of the questions we're getting is on first person narratives and understanding family history and history of communities. And the other side of this is things like the big political issues like voting and voting rights in the US and treaties and all of these things. What are the resources that you're pointing people towards? So if we're starting for like, are there specific places where you're like, these are great spaces to understand issues around Indigenous people. And this is where you can hear Indigenous voices in other than the center, the report, which is a really lovely starting point. Are there other spaces that you would point people towards?
Yeah, I think there's a number of depending on what the focus is for people. There's a number of organizations that can be followed, for example, for um, up to date resources on at least what's happening with various indigenous peoples. I would say the International Indian Treaty Council is one. They do publish on the website. They have a news section there that gives updates of various situations for indigenous peoples, whether they be violations of rights or what indigenous peoples are doing at the United Nations, what they're fighting for, what they're focusing on, engagement in that process. There's also national organizations that people can follow. In the United States, for example, you have the National Congress of American Indians. That's an organization that advocates for American Indian rights, and they engage with the U.S. government and in those spaces, and sometimes they're engaging internationally as well. The Treaty Council, I think, engages a bit more internationally, so they'll be involved in the climate change discussions, biological diversity, now the Oceans Treaty that was just adopted this year that just came into force. Those are some. Locally in the New York area, I'm not sure if that's of interest to folks, but there is an American Indian Community House that does a number of programs around the year that people can go to, cultural programs, so that allow people to come and understand various viewpoints of various tribes. There's another one in the New York area called the Red Hawk uh, Native Arts Association. That's another one. And there's also an organization that's focusing more on mental health for Indigenous peoples in the New York area called the Urban Indigenous collective. And so those are some that you can engage with locally. You could follow their websites or their social media accounts to find out about various programs that are happening. And then if you're not in the New York area, I would just do a search for American Indian organizations or Native American organizations in the area. You can do a Google search and find out what are these organizations or what are some of the local tribes. Maybe they have cultural events that go on, powwows or festivals that they might put on during the year, special programs that could be happening. There's a lot of work right now that's focusing on and this is nationwide, missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is a very big issue. So there are various organizations that are focusing on that particular subject and engaging in that. There's another group called the Native American Boarding School Coalition that talks about how there could be reparations for that whole boarding school era and the trauma that it caused Native communities. Um, and just coming back to New York again, I know I'm involved in October. There's a big event that we hold out at Randall's Island for Indigenous Peoples Day as an alternative to Columbus Day. So that's another place where you can come and you can hear speakers, see some of the cultural presentations, engage with the native artisans and craftspeople, things like that. That's go on. There's many opportunities, and also I'm on social media if people would like to connect with me on if they're on Instagram or Facebook, and you can also connect with me, and I share information as well about various issues. If there's petitions that I get that I feel that are important, I try to forward those around, and many of the organizations that I do that same type of advocacy work. There's always financial support that's welcomed by all these various organizations for initiatives, because many of them are not funded by the federal government, especially the organizations. We're not talking about the tribes themselves that have a relationship with the federal government, but I'm talking about local organizations where you might want to get some more information or participate in a particular program, etc.
Roberto, is the Randall's Island event, is it an internal celebration for the community, or is the target audience outside people who
It's
want
for
to?
everybody. Yeah, it's for everybody. It's a way that the local indigenous peoples can get together and share culture, but it's definitely for others to learn about indigenous peoples, the most pressing issues that indigenous peoples are facing, and we not only have the participation of indigenous American Indians, meaning it could be American Indians from North, Central, or South America. So when I say American Indians, sometimes I'm not just talking about the U.S. I'm talking about from throughout the Americas. And the Taino, for example, were the very first. My ancestors were the very first indigenous peoples in the America to be called Indians, right? Because we were the ones that were encountered Columbus, and we're not, it goes on right through there. But yeah, it is an opportunity for learning and for sharing and for allyship and building those coalitions. That type of event is welcoming to that. And then there's other, like the Center for Earth Ethics. I mean, there's a number of programs that the center does over the year, and quite a number of those programs are either focused on indigenous peoples or an indigenous or particular indigenous community or an issue, or they are part of a program talking about a larger issue and just how indigenous voices. So the Center for Earth Ethics is another one that I would suggest to just to follow beyond the report. Check their website, get onto the mailing list so that you're updated on particular points, because they're focusing also on environmental issues in the area, and this is another way that people can get involved, right? Beyond just reading or something like that.
I think one of the things that came across is how, I mean, it's a big world and there Indigenous issues all over the world. And
Yes.
and it sounds like between the International Treaties Organization that there is a sense of alliance, allegiance, and that it's uplifting. Okay, so this is the organization that, or the area that needs assistance at this time. Is there one particular area at this moment that seems the most pressing, that you as a large community, large and disparate, that there's a lot of different people involved, that is really that they're pushing for in this moment, that where allyship would be most effective?
Well, I mean, yes, absolutely. But what we're seeing really is because of the rise of populism, right, and a more conservative approach, a right-wing conservative approach. Uh, there's really been a rise in discrimination, right? There's really been an assault on human rights. There's really been an assault on the environment, and all these things are linked. And here we thought, we were making again incremental advancements towards a better way of doing things, towards more consultation, towards more working together, rather than just thinking about one particular community, but really thinking about, an overall action, how it affects multiple communities, right? Which is why, more affluent communities don't want, for example, a garbage dump in their area, right? But yet they'll be okay with,
Or a pipeline?
a pipeline, exactly, right? So, this is just an example, but we've seen really a real assault on the idea of human rights, the denial of climate change, when our communities have long been associated with the front lines of climate change. There's communities in Alaska that the land now, because of the erosion of permafrost and things like that, and the rise of the sea level, more impactful storms, their communities are crumbling, right? So they have to move now away. There's real impacts from climate change that we could see as Indigenous peoples, things that have never occurred before. In the Caribbean, for example, we're having more and more powerful storms, right? And I'll give you an example, and it might sound kind of quaint to some people, but in the old days, Taino people used to sing. Hurricanes are part of life in the Caribbean. The word hurricane comes from our word huracan, and that has to do with a particular deity, and a female-oriented deity, which is why hurricanes were named after females in the very beginning. I don't know if you remember. Now they named them after whoever, but our people used to gather and sing at certain times of the year to the hurricanes, to ask, for leniency, and for that to take pity on the people, right? But they knew that they would be coming. But what our elders have taught us, that over years of assimilation and people moving away from the traditional spirituality and traditional relationship with that energy of the hurricane, that spirit of the hurricane, people are not, or have not been singing to the hurricane uh, as much anymore. It's really very few, but yet now the hurricanes are more and more and more impactful, right? More powerful and more devastating. So it gives you an idea of how our people are seeing it. In other words, if we had the consciousness to deal with the environment in a respectful way, we might not be having this issue now, right? So in a way, the singing is symbolic, right? The singing to the hurricane is symbolic to our lack of respect for the overall environment, and now the denial of the actions of our lack of respect, right? So for so long, we had the problem with the ozone layer, right? People didn't believe it, it'll be all right, but then they took action, and it actually repaired itself over some time. I mentioned with the salmon in California. It ruined people, local economies, and especially relationship with Indigenous peoples. But since they removed some of those dams, the salmon have returned, right, for the first time in many, many years. And so it's actually showing, like, when you have consciousness and you work with the environment and not just against it, it'll be better for everybody. It'll be better for the animals. It'll be better for all of us and for the earth.
I I feel like, and I don't know, Stephanie, if you have anything you want to kind of say as we're wrapping up here, but I think that that sense of working with the environment as opposed to the oppositional is such a, that I think, and the idea of correction, that there is like a moment of hope in a topic which feels very despairing. So I
Yes.
appreciate that as a message in this moment.
Well, I think the people that likes to tell stories, or as two peoples that like to tell stories a lot about where we come from, it feels like making sure we tell the stories of the bright spots now at a time that feels so anxiety provoking. Like it seems like your community has stories to tell that lots of us would benefit from about how little changes. Things aren't done.
Yes.
Yeah, just because the salmon has disappeared doesn't mean they're never coming back.
Yeah.
And telling those stories feels incredibly important now. Thank you for sharing with us. Really, I think one of the things I realized is how little most Jewish communities actually have opportunities regularly to hear from Indigenous communities or Indigenous leaders. And it would be good for us to be more locally connected and figuring out like how do we work together. The environment is something that we have as a shared priority. We're all going to live or die depending on how healthy it is. And your community has a lot of wisdom around it, and it would be wise for us to figure out what we can learn and advance together. We share it.
Thank you.
Thank you for the work that
Thank
you do and spending your time with us.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. Happy to do that, and it's an honor to be invited and to share, and for folks to listen. So I really appreciate that. Appreciate the questions too.
I want to thank you both. I feel like the whole time, Stephanie, your questions were pointing me towards a place where, like, oh, this is incredibly Jewish. That this too is incredibly Jewish. And I feel like that's one of those things that maybe we don't think about very often. And I appreciated the opportunity to think about that as a challenge to the people who are here. Maybe this is an opportunity for you. I'll put all of the links together in a resource sheet. I'll get those out to you probably tomorrow. But beyond that, what are the communities that you should look for in your area? Next week, we're turning back very specifically to our season and specifically the book of Esther. We're going to be looking at Esther in a way that, at least for our Jan Urbach from JTS, she had never really considered it in this way, is the question of authority and what are responses to authority. And I'm pretty excited. She'll be in conversation with Dr. Andy Moray from Fordham University. And I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation, as this was as well. Thank you all so much. And we hope you'll join us again and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.